What's good, YouTube? Welcome back. Today it is the LazyDaze Channel and we're back at it again doing some more history reaction for you guys today. And we are doing some Historia Civilis, the Congress of Vienna, Part 1. Now, we are also breaking this Part 1 into two separate parts. So this is Part 1 of Part 1. So we will get to all of it because it's a bit of a longer video. We are going to break it down. I'm really looking forward to finding out what this has in store for us. You guys have highly suggested this video and we do want to jump back on it. It's obviously some of the events that happened after the Napoleonic Wars and so on and so forth. So we are looking forward to finding out that, that information. If you guys haven't already, head over to Historia Civilis' channel and links in the description box down below. And if you guys are enjoying our content, like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell. But we are going to jump straight into this one.
Let's do this. Sorry, Finn.
By the summer of 1814, the combined strength of Europe brought France to its knees. After almost 25 years of war, Europe was finally at peace.
Look at Europe. What a mess.
Nobody knew this at the time, but the peace that was negotiated here and now served as the launching pad for a 99-year run without a major war between great powers. A monumental achievement.
It never happened again, mate.
We're in it right now.
Yeah, I know.
After hostilities ceased, the immediate problem was that nobody quite knew what the world looked like anymore. The preliminary peace...
No, Jack, we're in a new one now. We're not in the same 99 years.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, alright. I just need to make sure.
Peace agreement that ended the war in 1814,
you're not going to get another 99
restored
years of
international borders.
Between the... I don't know. We're on... We're like 80 years, aren't we? 44. So what, 11 years? We're on like 88 now.
Yeah, so we probably ain't going to get to 99.
Borders as they had existed in 1792, with some slight modifications. But these borders on the map no longer reflected the reality on the ground. The Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland, existed on paper, but in reality it was under Russian occupation. All of these tiny German states existed on paper, but in reality they were under Prussian control. France existed on paper, but in reality it was under the joint occupation of the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the British. All that being said, by the summer of 1814, the Treaty of Paris had been signed. The 1792 borders had been temporarily thrown back into place, and the war was over, at least for now. The urgent task at hand was to take this hyper-volatile international system and transform it into something more stable. Most people recognized that the 1792 borders were no good in the long run, because those borders had led directly to almost 25 years of war. The prevailing mood among the victors was that a well-balanced international system was necessary, one that could resist the kind of reckless expansionism that the French Revolution had unleashed upon the world. But before we talk about the new system that was created at this time, let's first discuss the 5 great powers as they existed in 1814. This whole period of instability began with the French Revolution, so let's start with France. Defeated, under enemy occupation, but nevertheless, still a great power.
That's jokes.
When Napoleon was defeated, the Allied victors imposed a set of peace conditions upon France. All things considered, they were pretty moderate. The first of these called for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy from before the Revolution. This brought the 58-year-old King Louis XVIII to the throne, the younger brother to the king that was executed under the Revolution. The second condition for peace was a shiny new French constitution that would guarantee certain political rights. The third condition was an agreement from the new king to leave many of the revolutionary reforms in place. The massive redistribution of wealth and land was to be mostly upheld by the new regime. so it goes. The old French aristocracy were allowed to safely return to the country, but they were a shadow of their former selves, and never again rose to the dominant political position that they had enjoyed in the 18th century. The restoration of the Bourbon king was intended to make the conservatives happy. The new constitution was intended to make the moderate liberals happy. The preservation of the Republican reforms was intended to make the revolutionaries happy. It was a big, sloppy compromise, and its purpose was to hold France together so that there was actually a France for the Allies to negotiate with.
All right.
Despite its recent defeat, France remained a heavyweight on the continent. They were the second most populous country in Europe, and still controlled the most potent military force in the world. So long as those facts remained true, France would remain a great power. With that in mind, France's objective going into the upcoming peace negotiations was, to the extent possible, minimize any future French concessions or territorial losses. Many European leaders understood that France would need to opt in to any new international system if there was to be lasting peace. Others were simply out for blood. France's job for the immediate future would be to keep the wolves at bay.
Makes sense considering what situation it was left in, you know what I mean?
To this end, the new king brought in an experienced hand to serve as his foreign minister, Talleyrand. Talleyrand was a French nobleman who got in on the ground floor of the French Revolution. Through the revolution, he became a politician, then a diplomat, then an early supporter of Napoleon. Talleyrand served as Napoleon's foreign minister for 8 years, until the two had a falling out, and Talleyrand resigned. After this, Talleyrand began telling others that Napoleon's endless lust for war would bring ruin upon France. In time, he began passing intelligence to France's enemies and launched preliminary discussions with them regarding what a post-Napoleonic France might look like. This relationship made him an obvious choice to bring back into government after France was defeated. That's the generous way of looking at Talleyrand. The ungenerous way of looking at him is that he was a cockroach, a survivor, an opportunist. Every time the political winds began to shift, Talleyrand suddenly found himself on the other side. Every time the French government looked unstable, Talleyrand found an excuse to be out of the country. When it became clear that France would not win the war, Talleyrand was the first to abandon ship.
Yeah, damn straight.
Boats. But no matter what you think of him, Talleyrand became the most powerful person in the French government after the fall of Napoleon. And yes, I am including the king when I say that. His great task as foreign minister would be to keep the wolves at bay and reintegrate France back into the international order as a co-equal great power.
If he does do it though,
let's now turn our attention to the four great powers that brought Napoleonic France to its knees, starting with the greatest of the great powers and working our way down.
Good old Britain.
Britain! True life of a Brexit geezer.
As always, the historian Eric Hobsbawm puts it better than I ever could. Britain, quote, had by 1815 gained the most complete victory of any power in the entire history of the world, having emerged from 20 years of war against France as the only industrialized economy, the only naval power, and virtually the only colonial power in the world.
Jesus.
The thing that made Britain the greatest of the great powers was the Royal Navy. Sometimes people talk about strategic depth, which is the idea that during wartime, you want the lines of battle drawn as far from your major population centers as possible. In 1815, Britain's strategic depth extended to all the world's oceans and beyond. No country has ever been safer from invasion. The moment of Britain's great victory was also a moment of great uncertainty for the British monarchy. George III was king, and was unable to enjoy Britain's newfound prosperity. George probably suffered from a number of genetic disorders, as well as other things, like bipolar disorder and dementia. At times, it was quite bad. He was in constant physical pain and suffered from hallucinations, delusions, and memory loss. He was occasionally coherent, but not often, and not for long. In 1811, at the height of the war, the British Parliament transferred the powers of the monarchy to the king's 48-year-old son, which made him the Prince Regent. Within a few years, the king was no longer presentable enough to appear in public.
Oh dear.
Bless him.
Britain's dominant geopolitical position was all the more impressive, considering the fact that of the 5 great powers, Britain was the 4th most populous. But the picture becomes more clear when you look at wealth. In 1815, the British people were on average the wealthiest people in the world, at least 50% wealthier than their counterparts on the continent.
Not anymore!
This trend would continue for the rest of the century, and by the year 1900, they would be almost twice as wealthy as the average European. This incredible wealth and geopolitical security helped produce a uniquely robust political culture, with lively debates and an informed electorate. In 1815, the British Prime Minister was the Earl of Liverpool, a kind of centrist conservative. The fact that he was kind of conservative was a huge deal. It was the manifestation of a seismic shift going on within British politics. Let me explain why. Since the 17th century, there had been 2 political factions within the British Parliament. The Whigs, a liberal faction who favored giving Parliament more power, and the Tories, a conservative faction who favored giving the king more power. England in the 17th century was utterly consumed by the power struggle between these 2 factions. They even fought a civil war over it. Over the course of this struggle, England swung wildly between having an authoritarian king and no king at all, sending one to the grave and another into exile. By the end of the 17th century, the question was settled. The Whigs won. Parliament became the supreme political authority in England, and the monarchy began to fade into the background. This brought about a really strange period in British politics, something that will never happen again. For more than 100 years, every British Prime Minister was a Whig. This period is sometimes called the Whig supremacy or the Whig domination, sometimes even the Whig oligarchy. I like the term Whig oligarchy because it gets at one of the key political truths of this period. I described the Whigs as the faction of Parliament, but it might be more accurate to describe them as the faction of modernity and industrialization. This meant that Whig political power emanated from cities and business and capital, while Tory political power emanated from aristocratic landowners and the countryside. At the time, the Whig modernist and pro-business worldview called for free trade and religious toleration, alongside a slow and steady expansion of political rights. The Whigs had a general distaste for slavery in all its forms, even while they continued to participate in the business of slavery.
Yeah, very hypocritical.
So for more than 100 years, the Whigs dominated British politics, and for the first 50 or 60 years, there were basically no close elections. The Whigs routinely won 300 to 400 seats in Parliament, and the other factions were lucky to break 100.
Wow.
With such a dominant command over Parliament, it was only a matter of time before the Whig faction started to develop its own factions, and then factions within factions, and then factions within factions within factions. This competition between sub-factions actually made elections competitive again, and in the 1770s, Britain elected its first Whig prime minister from the conservative sub-faction. During the French Revolution, perhaps in reaction to the French Revolution, Britain elected several more conservative Whig prime ministers, but they all took great care to calm people's nerves and make it clear that they were all still Whigs. They were all members of one big political party. One was brave enough to brand himself as an independent Whig, whatever that means, but nobody dared go any further. So by 1814, Lord Liverpool, another conservative Whig, was Prime Minister. But he was in an impossible situation. His conservative Whig majority in Parliament was modest, and his sub-faction seemed to be falling apart. 4 men were asked to form a government before him, and all 4 failed to hold the coalition together. The only reason Liverpool was able to get the job done was because although he was a conservative Whig, he was on the liberal end of the conservative Whig spectrum.
Right.
I spoke of factions within factions within factions before. I was not joking. As soon as peace was announced, protests started popping up all over England calling for bread or blood. One publication at the time wrote that, quote, all the triumphant sensations of national glory seem almost obliterated by general depression.
Oh.
Change was in the air. It was not a good time to be a conservative politician in Britain. In fact, it seemed entirely possible that the conservative Whig moment was simply a reaction to the French Revolution. And with peace, the liberal Whig natural order may just reassert itself.
Interesting.
This is mad.
Yeah.
All of that is simply a long-winded way of saying that when it was time to negotiate with the other great powers, Liverpool found himself politically constrained from every direction. If the negotiations went badly, he could not only be thrown out of government, but the conservative Whig sub-faction could be wiped out forever. The peace negotiations would be handled by the British Foreign Secretary, the Viscount of Castlereagh. Castlereagh had strong opinions when it came to Europe. There were some pro-war nuts in the conservative Whig sub-faction, but he was not one of them. Castlereagh's view was that every British intervention on the continent was a colossal policy failure. If he had his way, Britain would never again send an army to Europe. One of the reasons Castlereagh thought this way is because he was an imperialist. As Hobsbawm said, Britain at this time was virtually the only colonial power in the world. Some of the more liberal Whigs had mixed feelings about that, but Castlereagh didn't. He thought it was awesome. He believed that Britain's future was out in the colonies, and it would be best for Britain if Europe remained stable and peaceful and boring.
So that they can trade.
There was some hypocrisy at
That
work.
does make sense.
Yeah.
Peace
does.
between the great powers meant that nobody was allowed to touch any of Britain's new conquests. Peace between the great powers meant that Britain could instead maintain its advantage and focus on making money off of its colonies. All of that being said, Liverpool and Castlereagh genuinely wanted peace. The British public had been exhausted by the war, and if the conservative Whigs wanted to maintain their majority, they were going to have to show some results. Together, Liverpool and Castlereagh came up with a list of specific goals for the upcoming negotiations. The most important item was that they wanted the Netherlands reformed and strengthened on the English Channel. 2 reasons for this. First, they wanted an ally on the continent to break up any consolidation along the coast. Second, this was historically a natural path for French expansion, and going forward, the British wanted to cut that off. Along these same lines, they also wanted the French out of Spain, and Spain restored to its previous borders under its previous monarch.
Yeah.
Castlereagh also had instructions to make sure that the new peace deal would keep Italy free from French influence. Historically, every time the French started messing around with Italy, it meant that France was becoming way too powerful.
Okay.
No more. Going forward, Italy would be a red line. Castlereagh had other goals as well, but the big ones were all about containing France. Before the peace negotiations began, Castlereagh back-channeled his list of priorities to both Austria and Prussia, and got from them an unofficial thumbs up. At least 2 of the other great powers wouldn't oppose any of Britain's big-ticket items, and France wasn't exactly in a place to put up much of a fight. The only remaining unknown going into the negotiations was Russia. Nobody quite knew what they wanted or what their intentions were. When Castlereagh met Tsar Alexander of Russia for the first time, he wrote to his prime minister that he believed that the Russian monarch was not of sound mind. It's difficult to characterize
losing
Tsar
their minds.
Alexander
Everyone.
because it seems that most of his mental energy was caught up in creating narratives about what kind of person he was, and not so much in what he did or how he behaved. The thing that confused Castlereagh, and confuses me to be honest, is that Alexander had 8 or 10 of these narratives going through his head at the same time, and wasn't particularly bothered when they contradicted each other. Let me give you some specific examples. Alexander considered himself a true Enlightenment monarch, and told anybody who would listen that he believed in a limited constitutional monarchy, and wanted Russia to have elections, and a parliament, and independent courts. At the same time, he ruled Russia as a tyrannical dictator, which was justified in his mind because he believed that he was God's chosen instrument on Earth.
Red
These
flags.
two thoughts are not compatible, but Alexander did not.
Might as well just put Kanye's face up against those red flags. Chosen by God. Oh, God.
When someone says chosen by God, that's it.
That's
It's
it.
Game
That's
over.
It. You're done. You're done. You can't win against that person. Just walk away from it. Don't entangle yourself in that situation at all.
That's a good idea.
But Alexander did not see a contradiction. He would simply switch between these two modes of thought, depending on who he was talking to and how he felt that day. Here's another example. Alexander believed himself to be the most honorable man in Europe, a man who revered ritual and tradition and justice. Simultaneously, he believed that God made him emperor of Russia for a reason, and if he needed to go back on his word and use brute force to implement his will, that was all part of God's plan. These contradictory beliefs made Alexander impossible to deal with. His positions came off as utterly random, and they could change at any time depending on his mood. He was unpredictable and unreliable and incomprehensible, particularly bad traits for a diplomat. So naturally, Alexander selected himself to represent Russia at the post-war peace conference.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
As the most populous country in Europe, Russia was a formidable land power. But that inherent strength was undercut by weak institutions, weak governance, and the fact that Russia remained a technological backwater. This backwardness had always been a source of immense insecurity for Russian monarchs, but by 1814, all that insecurity was gone. Russia had just done the impossible and defeated Napoleon. At least, in their own imagination, that's what happened. The truth is a little more complicated. Years of careful diplomacy had laid the groundwork for a coordinated attack against the French, and Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia was simply the catalyst.
Yep.
Had Napoleon been successful in Russia, the rest of Europe's great powers would have just waited for the next opportunity. But when the French started losing to Russia, most of Europe sprang into action. The plan was for every major European army to advance on Paris at a steady pace, but to pull back whenever opposed by the French army. The Allies knew that they couldn't defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, but with all of Europe's armies advancing as one, they wouldn't have to. Napoleon couldn't be everywhere at once. Even if he won every possible battle, the Allies would still take Paris. The point is that no one country defeated Napoleon. Every country defeated Napoleon. But Tsar Alexander didn't see it like this. In his mind, it was all his doing. As part of their plan, the Allies had developed lists of key French towns to capture on the way to Paris. The Allied armies would need their logistical support, especially with several French armies coming up behind them. Tsar Alexander was personally in command of the Russian army, and once he was within spitting distance of French territory, he abandoned this plan and broke off from his allies and advanced on Paris alone. Alexander later said that this was a matter of personal honor. Never mind the commitment to his allies to all advance as one. Apparently personal honor can only go so far.
Wow.
Gaze.
Wow, this man's personal honour is just
What a dick.
making him an absolute ignorant person to deal with. I can't. I can't. Absolutely outrageous. I think we're going to wrap it up for part 1 there, and we will leave the next 24 minutes for the next part of part 1. So part 2 of part 1, if that
Part
makes
2 of
sense. I enjoyed it. I'm really enjoying finding out the extra information about the fall, because I didn't really think about it. What is the after effect? Obviously, we're only halfway through Russia, so I'm definitely looking forward to finding out what is to come. If you guys are looking forward to our reaction to that, then please like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but we will catch you in the next video.
See you in a bit.